Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure and an honor to make this presentation to you today at this critical juncture in world affairs as the world community strives to lay the foundations of a green, sustainable and inclusive global economy. It is most appropriate that we should meet here in the city of Geneva, which has been identified for decades with the efforts of the community of nations to advance human rights, peace and cooperation, and as we have just heard from the Mayor, to undertake very effective and rapid action in regard to environmental and climate issues. I have been asked to provide you with a swift overview of the state of the world in environmental and social terms, and then I will sketch some key issues in the field of climate change as we move towards Paris 2015, and I will draw on the conclusions of a high-level international task force which was convened by President Gorbachev within the framework of Green Cross International, and the report of that task force is available, called Facing the Realities of Climate Change. Ladies and gentlemen, global economic growth has undoubtedly produced enormous benefits for hundreds of millions of people in both developing and developed countries. Many of us are privileged to enjoy a standard of living unprecedented in human history. But at the start of the 21st century, we should have no illusions. We are heading fast into a gathering storm of connected environmental, economic, social, and political challenges. The future, of course, is not preordained. It will be determined by our choices and by our actions, if that is, we act in time. But time is running out. The issues which confront the world community today are on an unprecedented scale, with truly global implications. They are intensifying fast, and because they are interconnected and systemic, they will behave individually and together in non-linear ways. We face, therefore, a future not of steady, predictable trends, but of escalating risks of major disruptions and of rapid, unpredictable change. This is particularly true of the climate issue. We have negotiated without significant effect for more than 20 years, and now face real risks of climate destabilization. The present models of economic growth to which we remain committed are failing. They are failing not only in environmental and social terms, but also even in economic terms. We cannot, in fact, solve the problems of the 21st century with the tools of the 20th. It is clear that we badly need new ideas and new approaches to organization if we are to achieve sustainable and equitable progress for a world population which will rise to well over 9 billion people by 2050. Governments alone, of course, cannot resolve the climate, environmental and social threaten the future. These have deep roots in our values, our behavior, economies and our societies. But on a more positive note, there are huge potentials of creativity, knowledge, scientific and technological capacities and resources of all kinds which could be intelligently deployed to create a more just, stable and sustainable world. I hope that this conference will set out some lines of action to mobilize these capabilities in the interests of all of humanity. Practical examples and commitments across the world in states, in cities, in businesses and communities, and in civil society all demonstrate that resource-efficient, low-carbon, equitable and inclusive paths of development are feasible, and also that they can be economically beneficial. If, however, we continue on a business-as-usual path, the human, environmental and economic consequences will be devastating for both future and present generations. This raises, ladies and gentlemen, an obvious question. Remain committed to a path of world development which is clearly failing in environmental, human and economic terms when far better paths of development are available. So where are we now, which is the topic of our discussion this morning? According to the World Bank, some 1.3 billion people are trapped in poverty today, while a billion people are living on less than $2 a day, with their basic needs for security, employment, health, food unmet. And the inequalities between rich and poor are widening, both within and between countries. 2% of the richest people in the world own around 50% of the world's wealth, while the poorer half only own 4%. Thus, in a world economy over $70 trillion a year, billions of people in both rich and poor countries are excluded from the benefits of progress. This represents not only a failure of policy and organization, but a vast waste of human capabilities and a profound moral and social failure as well. In this Anthropocene age, the scale of human activities is devastating the environmental and ecological systems on which humanity absolutely depends. This underlines the importance of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which propose a broader framework for action beyond the narrow focus on economic growth as defined by GDP. As pointed out by the Club of Rome in 1972 in Limits to Growth, it is to assume that the global economy can continue to increase exponentially on the present consumption-driven fossil fuel and resource-intensive base, simply because the injuries to the environment are rendering this path unsustainable. A few points will make this crystal clear. First, according to the list of IUCN, nearly 20,000 species of animals and plants around the globe, that's to say of have identified, are at risk of extinction. We ourselves, we humans, are provoking the sixth in the past 540 million years. Humanity is in fact overusing the regenerative capacities of the biosphere by some 50% each year. We are in fact using up our biological capital, not only our biological revenue, at the cost of future generations, and this is evidently unsustainable. We are also depleting the energy and physical resources of the planet at an unsustainable rate. Global material extraction has increased 80% in the past 30 years. The fresh water, which is vital to human life and to all the ecosystems on which we depend, is under increasing stress across the world, and water use is doubling every 20 years. The state of the oceans, which support 95% of life on this planet, is also dire. Human impacts have changed the oceans more in the last 30 years than in previous human history. And as a consequence of rising concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere and then in the oceans, mean ocean acidity has increased by 30%. This is a crucial issue with severe consequences for marine life, for human food security, and also for the carbon cycle and thus the global climate. President Gorbachev stressed the links between these. Make one link very clear. The natural systems of the biosphere currently absorb around 50% of all our emissions. As they degrade under the assault of humanity, net emissions into the atmosphere increase. Let me now turn more specifically to the realities of climate change. The world is in fact warming fast. The past decade was by far the hottest decade ever measured, and 2014 was the hottest year in the instrumental record until, that is, 2015. The Arctic is at the warmest temperature for 150,000 years, and Arctic sea ice levels are falling fast. And it is the oceans which are absorbing much of the excess heat. The scientific understanding of all the processes at work is supported by the vast majority of scientists competent in the field, and it provides a secure basis for the necessary policies and for precautionary action if we choose to take it. The conclusions of science are clear and compelling and supported by a tide of practical physical evidence across the world, and also by a solid understanding of the paleoclimatic record. Let me summarize the present situation and the future risks. The impacts we see across the world today are the consequences of a temperature rise of only 0.8 degrees Celsius, perhaps 0.9 now. So everything we see happening is 0.8, 0.9 degrees. Since pre-industrial times, reckoned to be 1750. If these consequences today are the result of a temperature rise of 0.8 degrees, we are right to be very concerned about the future impacts of a warming climate in future years. The target of the international negotiations is to hold the temperature rise to 2 degrees. This is not founded on science, this is a political decision. And this is too high. It represents, in fact, the boundary between dangerous climate change and extremely dangerous climate change. And so far, as I have said, over 21 years of negotiations, we have failed to achieve significant results. During this period, the level of greenhouse gas emissions has risen by some 65%, not reduced, but risen by 65%. We are now on a business as usual path towards a devastating rise in global temperature of around 5 degrees if we do nothing. This would entail at least double this rise in critical regions of the world, notably the Arctic, West Antarctic, and high altitudes, with evident consequences for sea level rise. Recent studies of the carbon emissions cuts which are proposed for COP21 conclude that the outcome of the Paris conference will very probably leave the world on a path to a rise of between 3 and 4 degrees of average warming, which would, of course, have devastating consequences. This presumes, of course, that governments will, in fact, implement the cuts which they indicate in Paris. When asked what is the difference between a rise of 2 degrees and a rise of 4 degrees, a top climate scientist replied, "That's easy. The difference is simply human civilization." Those are the risks, ladies and gentlemen, that we run. Because of years of delay, the risks of catastrophic climate change have greatly increased, as have the costs of mitigation and adaptation in response to those impacts which are already inevitable. Through denial and delay, we now face the existential threat to the future of the natural world and of our civilization, and we must not make the same mistake again. Climate justice and full participation must lie at the core of any agreement and of any policies to address climate change as a legitimate basis for international action. Poor developing countries are understandably giving priority to economic growth and to the eradication of poverty. They emphasize the historic responsibility of the industrialized countries which generated emissions for centuries in order to achieve their growth in the past. As Prime Minister Modi of India made clear, India will not consent to cut emissions which will undermine our efforts to end poverty. For all these reasons, the preservation of a stable climate is essential if we are to meet the needs of a growing world population and to preserve a decent and peaceful future for all of us in an interdependent world. In reality, there is no choice between development or emissions reduction to avert the threats of climate change. Development and environment must be integrated within one coherent strategy. This is, in fact, the strategy adopted by China, 12th five-year plan, and now again in the 13th five-year plan, to reorient the Chinese economy onto a more sustainable path. We must recognize, as underlined by Pope Francis, the moral and spiritual dimensions of the ecological and climate crises we face, and of our consumption-driven civilization. And we must move from the presumption of human dominion over the earth as a resource to be exploited towards that of custodian and protector of the earth, to establish a new relationship with nature and ourselves. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that this brief review has clarified the scale and urgency of the threats and risks to the future we face. Let me conclude with 4 points. First, climate change is moving faster than anticipated. Scientists have been too cautious. The climate crisis is a reality today. It is not a problem to be put off into the future. Through extreme weather events, droughts, heat waves, floods, and ecological degradation, it is already destroying the lives and hopes of millions of people. And it is reversing the gains of decades of development efforts and disrupting the complex web of relationships on which our globalized world economy depends. Although they are not responsible, it is the poor and vulnerable of the world who are paying the highest price. As the impacts of climate change intensify, there is a growing risk of violence and leading to humanitarian crises and increasing flows of energy, with the tragic consequences we see around us today. This underlines the critical links between world peace and climate change, now widely considered in many countries, notably the US and China, as a non-traditional threat to security. But we still continue to spend vast amounts on armaments, $1.7 trillion in 2014, which are the classic response to traditional security threats. And we spend little on what are the greatest threats now: the future of humanity, poverty and inequality, environmental degradation, and climate change. This must change if we are to preserve a peaceful and cooperative world and to achieve the goals stated a month ago in New York of sustainable development. Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps the most significant risk we face is that we are not confronted by a problem of what is generally called global warming, which creates the ice gradual process. We face the real risk of sudden disruption of the complex interlinked systems which drive climate change. Scientists are deeply concerned that a number of self-reinforcing feedback processes are starting up as Arctic sea ice diminishes, as the West Antarctic ice shelf weakens, as methane is emitted from melting permafrost and from beneath the northern oceans, and as forests and marine ecosystems are degraded under the assault of humanity. If we push these systems beyond certain thresholds, we will trigger irreversible climate change beyond human influence. If, therefore, we are to avoid catastrophic outcomes, we must ultimately decarbonize our economies, breaking our addiction to fossil fuel. It is widely recognized that if we are to have a chance, not 100% chance, but a chance of staying below the 2 degrees target, it is vital to leave a large proportion of proven fossil fuel reserves in the ground. As Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, the vast majority of the planet's carbon reserves are unburnable. A global carbon bubble is emerging in the world economy, where stranded asset values in the fossil fuel sector are now overvalued. It is urgent, therefore, to initiate an orderly transition to a climate-secure global energy system, even if we are to avoid the risk of massive financial dislocation. Paris 2015 must unambiguously establish climate change as a top priority for international cooperation and agree on rapid cuts in emissions and on strong and consistent action post-Paris. For all the reasons I have explained, we must finally recognize and respect the clear conclusions of science and push through the radical transformations of our economies and energy systems, which could avert the threat of catastrophic climate change. We must take bold action now to achieve a carbon neutral world by 2050. Perhaps we can use the climate crisis as a catalyst to reinvent our economies, foundations of the resource-efficient, prosperous, green and inclusive societies of the future. I hope that this conference can send a strong message to Paris to reinforce the growing movement in favor of effective and rapid action on climate change. Thank you very much.